Chapter 21. Flight. I thank you, Count, and you, dear lady, for the confidence you place in me, Malcolm said, and will carry out my trust were it to cost me my life. My plan is a simple one. The guard will be changed in half an hour's time. I have brought hither a suit of boys' garments, which I must pray the Countess Thekla to don, seeing that it will be impossible for her to sally out in her own garb. I show my pass to the new sentry, who will deem that my companion entered with me and is my apprentice, and will suppose that, since the sentry who preceded him suffered him to enter with me, he may well pass him out without question. I have a wagon in readiness, and shall, disguised as a peasant, start with it this evening. Thekla will be in the bottom, covered with straw. We shall travel all night. Tomorrow, when your attendant discovers that your daughter has escaped, she will at once take the news to the governor. The sentries will all be questioned, and it will be found that, whereas one clockmaker came in, 2 went out. The city will be searched, and the country round scoured. But if the horsemen overtake me, they will not suspect a solitary peasant with a wagon. The first danger over, I must be guided by circumstances. But in any case, Thekla must travel as a boy to the end of the journey. I design to make my way to Nuremberg. There I shall place her in the hands of my good friend Jans Boerhoff, whose wife and daughters will, I am sure, gladly care for her until the time that peace be made and you can rejoin her. The plan is a good one, the Count said. 'Tis hazardous, but there is no escape from such a strait as ours without risk. What say you, wife? I can think of nothing better, but, Thekla, are you ready to run the risks and the hardships of such a journey under the protection only of this gentleman? I am ready, mother, but I wish... You wish you could go in your own garments, with jewels on your fingers, and with a white horse to carry you, the Count said with a smile, for his spirits had risen with the hope of his daughter's escape. It cannot be. Malcolm's plan must be carried out to the letter, and your mother must cut off that long hair of yours. Your hair may be long again before I next see you. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke, and Thekla and the Countess both broke into a fit of crying. Leaving them by themselves, Malcolm returned to his work, and in half an hour had replaced the machinery of the clock and set it in motion, while a tender conversation went on between the Count and Countess and their daughter. By this time the sun had set. Malcolm said, I would not hurry your parting, Countess, but the sooner we are off now the better. Without a word the Countess rose, and taking the clothes which Malcolm produced, retired to her chamber with Thekla. Malcolm Graham, the Count said, it may be that we shall not meet again. The Emperor is not tender with obstinate prisoners. Should aught happen to me, I beseech you to watch over the happiness of my child. Had she been a year older, and had you been willing, I would have solemnly betrothed her to you, and should then have felt secure of her future. And though my estates may be forfeited by the Emperor, her mother's lands will make a dowry such as any German noble would gladly accept with his wife. If we should not meet again, and you in future years should seek her as your wife, you have my fullest approval and consent. Nay, it is my wish. I thank you most deeply, Count, but I put the thought from me, seeing that she is heiress to broad lands, and I, a Scottish soldier of fortune, whose lands are but a mere farm in comparison with your broad estates. But after what you have so generously said, I need no longer fear my heart, and will, when the time comes, remind you of your promise. For this journey I will put all such thoughts aside. I will watch over her safety as over my greatest treasure, trusting that in some happy change of circumstances, you and the dear Countess will give her to me. So be it. But here they come. The door opened and the Countess appeared, followed by Thekla, shrinking behind her mother's skirts in her boyish attire. The Count said gravely, Keep that cap down over your eyes, and try and assume a little more of the jaunty air of a boy. Fortunately, it will be dark below, and the sentry will not be able to mark how fair is your skin and how delicate your hands. Now, farewell, my child. Let us not stand talking. The quicker a parting is over, the better. Malcolm knows all my wishes concerning you, and when I am not with you, trust yourself to his advice and guidance as you would to mine. There, my darling, do not break down. You must be brave, for all our sakes. Should the Emperor hold me in durance, your mother will try and join you at Nuremberg. May God in heaven bless you and keep you. While the Count was embracing Thekla, may God in heaven bless you and keep you. She bravely, but in vain, tried to suppress her tears. The Countess opened the door, returned, kissed her daughter fondly, and placed her hand in Malcolm's, saying to the latter, God bless you. One last adieu, and Malcolm and Thekla stood alone in the anteroom. Now, he said, be brave. The danger is at hand, and your escape and my life depend upon your calmness. Carry this basket of tools and play your part as my apprentice. Just as we open the door, drop the basket. I will rate you soundly for your carelessness. Keep your head down, and do not let the light which swings over the door fall upon your face. For a minute or two, Thekla stood, struggling to master her emotions, and then she said in a quiet voice, I am ready. And taking up the basket of tools, she followed Malcolm down the stairs. Malcolm opened the door, and as he did so, Thekla dropped the basket. How stupid you are! Malcolm exclaimed sharply. How often have I told you to be careful? What's all this? The sentry asked, barring the way with his pike. Who are you, issuing from this house with so much noise? My orders are that none pass without an order from the governor. And such an order have I, Malcolm said, producing the document. There's the governor's seal. I was sent for to repair the clock in the Count of Mansfeld's apartment, and a rare job it has been. The sentry was unable to read, but he looked at the seal, which he had been taught to recognize. But there is only one seal. There are two of you. Malcolm said scornfully, Dost think that when 10 persons are admitted to pass in together, the governor puts 10 seals on the pass? You see for yourself it is but a young boy, my apprentice. Why, the governor himself left scarce an hour ago, and was in the apartment with me. Had it not been all right, he would have hauled me to prison quickly enough. As the sentry knew that the governor had left but a short time before, this convinced him. Standing aside, he allowed Malcolm and his companion to pass. Malcolm made his way first to the apartment where he had already settled for his lodging. He ran upstairs and hastily donned the suit of peasant's clothes, and then making the others into a bundle, descended again, and with Thekla made his way to the quiet spot outside the city gates where the wagon was standing ready. He had already paid the peasant half the sum agreed, and now handed him the remainder. The peasant asked no questions, but handing the torch to Malcolm, and telling him that he would find half a dozen more in the wagon, he took his way back to the town. As soon as he had gone, Malcolm arranged the straw in the bottom of the wagon so as to form a bed. But Thekla said that for the present she would rather walk with him. It is weeks since I have been out, and I shall enjoy walking for a time. Besides, it is all so strange. I should not sleep, were I to lie down. Malcolm consented, and taking his place at the head of the oxen, started them, walking ahead to light the way, and leading them by cords passed through their nostrils. He had not the least fear of pursuit, for it had been arranged that the Countess should inform their attendant that Thekla was feeling unwell and had retired to bed, and the woman, whatever she might suspect, would take care not to verify the statement. It would be the following morning before her absence was discovered. Malcolm tried his best to distract Thekla's thoughts from her parents, and from the strange situation in which he was placed, and chatted to her of the events of the war since he had last seen her, of the route which he intended to adopt, and the prospects of peace. In time, the girl acknowledged that she was tired and took her place in the wagon. Malcolm covered her up with straw and threw some sacks lightly over her, and then continued the journey. He traveled all night, and in the morning stopped at a wayside inn, where his arrival at that hour excited no surprise, as peasants often traveled at night because there was less chance of their carts being seized and requisitioned by the troops. He only stopped a short time to water and feed the oxen and to purchase some black bread and cheese. This he did, not because he required it, for he had an ample supply of provisions in the cart more suited for Thekla's appetite, but to act in the usual manner, and so avoid comment. Thekla was still asleep under the covering, which completely concealed her. Malcolm journeyed on until he came to a wood. Drawing aside from the road, he unyoked the oxen and allowed them to lie down, for they had already made a long journey. Then he woke Thekla, who leaped up gaily on finding that it was broad daylight. Breakfast was eaten, and after 4 hours' halt, they resumed their way, Thekla taking her place in the wagon again. At midday, Malcolm heard the trampling of horses behind him and saw a party of cavalry coming along at full gallop. The leader drew rein when he overtook the wagon. "Have you seen anything of 2 seeming craftsmen, a man and a boy, journeying along the road?" Malcolm shook his head. "I have seen no one on foot since I started an hour since." Without a word, the soldiers went on. They had no reason, indeed, for believing that those for whom they were in search had taken that particular road. As soon as Thekla's disappearance had been discovered by the waiting woman, she had hurried to the governor and, with many tears, informed him that the young countess was missing and that her couch had not been slept on. The governor had at once hurried to the spot. The count and countess resolutely refused to state what had become of their daughter. The sentries had all been strictly questioned, and it was found that the mender of clocks had, when he left, been accompanied by an apprentice whom the sentry previously on duty asserted had not entered with him. The woman was then closely questioned. She asserted stoutly that she knew nothing whatever of the affair. The count had commissioned her to obtain a craftsman to set the clock in order, and she had bethought her of a young man whose acquaintance she had made some time previously, and who had informed her in the course of conversation that he had come from Nuremberg and was a clockmaker by trade, and as he was a pleasant youth and comely, when he had spoken to her of marriage, she had not been averse. Now it was plain he had deceived her. Here she began to cry bitterly and loudly. Her story seemed probable enough, for any friend of the count who had intended to carry off his daughter would naturally have begun by ingratiating himself with her attendant. The count and countess were at once removed to the fortress. Orders were given that the town should be searched thoroughly, and any person answering to the description which the governor was able to give of the supposed clockmaker should be arrested, while parties of horse were dispatched along the roads with orders to arrest and bring to Prague any craftsman or other person accompanied by a young boy. The real fugitives pursued their way undisturbed. The anger of the emperor, when he heard of the escape of the prize he had destined for one of his favorite officers, was extreme. He ordered the count to be treated with the greatest rigor, and declared all his estates, and those of his wife, forfeited, the latter part of the sentence being at present inoperative, her estates being in a part of the country beyond the range of imperialist troops. The waiting maid was released, as there was no evidence whatever of her complicity in the affair. Malcolm continued his journey quietly towards the frontier of Bavaria, but on arriving at a small town within a few miles of Pilsen, he learned that Wallenstein had fallen back with his army to the place. Much alarmed, he determined to turn off by a cross road to avoid the imperialists. He had not, however, left the place before a party of imperialist horse rode in. Malcolm was at once stopped and was told that he must accompany the troops to Pilsen, as they had orders to requisition all carts for the supply of provisions for the army. Malcolm knew it was of no use to remonstrate. He moved to the marketplace, where he remained until all the wagons in the place had been collected. Loud and bitter were the curses which the peasants uttered at finding themselves taken from their homes and compelled to perform service for which the pay, if received at all, would be scanty in the extreme. There was, however, no help for it, and they started in a long procession, guarded by cavalry. On arriving, they were ordered to take up their station with a great train of wagons collected for the supply of the army. Thekla had, from her hiding place, heard the conversation, and was greatly alarmed. No one, however, approached the wagon, and it was not until darkness had set in that she heard Malcolm's voice whispering to her to arise quietly. "We must leave the wagon. It will be impossible for you to remain concealed here, for tomorrow I may be sent out to bring in supplies. For the present, we must remain in Pilsen. The whole country will be scoured by the troops. Here no one will think of looking for us, for Wallenstein's headquarters are the last place where we should be suspected of hiding. I have donned my craftsman dress again, and we will boldly seek for lodgings." They entered the town, and Malcolm presently found a woman who agreed to let him 2 rooms. He accounted for his need for the second room by saying that his young brother was ill and needed perfect rest and quiet, and that the filing and hammering which was necessary in his craft prevented the lad from sleeping. They were soon lodged in 2 attics at the top of the house, furnished only with a table, 2 chairs, and a truckle bed in each. But Malcolm was content with the shelter he had found. Seeing that it would be difficult at present to journey further, he determined to remain some little time in the town, thinking that he might be able to carry out the instructions which he had received from Colonel Monroe and obtain information as to the plans of Wallenstein. "You will have to remain a prisoner here, Thekla, almost as strictly as at Prague, for it would not do to risk the discovery that you are a girl by your appearing in the streets in daylight. And after dark, the streets occupied by Wallenstein soldiers are no place for peaceful persons. As I shall have you with me instead of being with strangers, the longer we stay here, the better." The next morning, Malcolm sallied out to see if he could find employment. There was, however, but one clockmaker in Pilsen, and the war had so injured his trade that he had discharged all his journeymen. But clocks were still comparatively rare luxuries, only seen in the houses of nobles and rich citizens. Knowing that Wallenstein was devoted to luxury and magnificence, always taking with him a long train of baggage and furniture, Malcolm thought it possible that he might obtain employment in his apartments. He went boldly to the castle where the Duke had established himself, stated that he was a clockmaker from the workshop of the celebrated horologist Master Jans Boerhoff, and could repair any clocks or watches that might be out of order. "You are the very man we need," the steward said. "My master, the Duke, carries with him some 6 clocks, and use what care I will in packing them, the shaking of the wagons is constantly putting them out of repair. This morning the Duke told me to bring a craftsman to get the clocks put in order, for it displeases him if they do not all keep time to the same minute." He led the way into the private apartments of the Duke. These were magnificently furnished, the walls being covered with rich velvet hangings. Thick carpets brought from the East covered the floors. Indeed, Wallenstein kept up a state far surpassing that of his imperial master. There were several clocks standing on tables and on brackets, for Wallenstein, although in most respects of a clear and commanding intellect, was a slave to superstition. He was always accompanied by an astrologer, who read for him the course of events from the movements of the stars, and indicated lucky and unlucky days, and the hours at which it was not propitious to transact important business. Hence it was that he placed so great an importance on the exact observance of the hour by his numerous timepieces. "Here are some of the clocks," the steward said. "Of course, you cannot work here. I will have a room prepared in the castle where you can work. Come at noon with your tools, and all shall be in readiness." At the hour appointed, Malcolm again presented himself. "The Duke has given personal instructions," the steward said, "that a closet close by shall be fitted up for you, in order that he himself, if he chooses, may see you at work." Malcolm was conducted to a small room near at hand. Here, one of the clocks which had stopped had been placed on the table, and he at once set to work. He soon discovered that one of the wheels had been shaken from its place by the jolting of the wagons, and that the clock could be set going by a few minutes' work. As, however, his object was to prolong his visit to the castle, he took it entirely to pieces. 2 hours later, the door opened. A tall, handsome man of commanding presence entered. Malcolm rose and bowed respectfully, feeling that he was in the presence of the great general. "You come from Nuremberg," Wallenstein said, "and have learned your craft in the workshop of Master Jans Boerhoff, who is well known as being the greatest master of his craft." Malcolm bowed silently. "It is strange," Wallenstein muttered to himself, "that this young man's destiny should be connected with mine. And yet the astrologer said that he who should present himself at the castle nearest to the stroke of 9 this morning would be a factor in my future. And my steward tells me the clock sounded 9 as this young man addressed him. He then asked Malcolm several questions as to the work upon which he was engaged, then said abruptly, "Dost know the day and hour on which you were born?" Malcolm was somewhat surprised at the question, but he replied that he had heard that he was born at the stroke of midnight on the last day of the year 1613. The Duke said no more, but left the closet and proceeded at once to an apartment near his own bedchamber, which had been fitted up for the use of his astrologer. The walls were hidden by a plain hanging of scarlet cloth. A large telescope stood at the window. A chart of the heavens was spread out on the table, and piles of books stood beside it. A tall, spare old man was seated at the table. He rose when Wallenstein entered. "I cannot but think," the Duke said, "your calculations must for once have been mistaken, and that there must have been an error in the hour. For I see not how the destiny of this craftsman, who seems to be a simple lad, can be connected with mine." "I have made the calculation 3 times, your grace," the old man replied, "and am sure there is no error." "He was born at midnight on December 31st, 1613. Work out his nativity and see if there are any affinities between us." The astrologer said, "By tonight I shall be able to give your grace the information you require." "Tonight we will also go over your calculations as to our great enterprise. It is all important that there should be no mistake. All seems well. The troops are mine, and will fight against whomsoever I bid them. By lavish gifts and favors, I have attached all my generals firmly to me. Soon this ungrateful emperor shall feel how rash and foolish he has been to insult the man to whom alone he owes it that he was not long ago a fugitive and an exile with the Swedes, victorious masters of his capital and kingdom. Have not I alone saved him? Did not I, at my own cost, raise an army and stand between him and the victorious Gustavus? Yet he evades all his promises. Not one step does he take to give me sovereignty of Bohemia, which he solemnly promised me. And he seems to think it is honor and reward enough for me to have spent my treasure and blood in his service. My time is at hand, and when the hand which saved his throne shall cast him from it, he will learn how rash he has been. And you say that the stars point to a favorable conjunction, and that the time for striking the great blow is at hand? Nothing could be better, the astrologer said. Jupiter, your own planet, and Mars are in the ascendant. Saturn is still too near them to encourage instant action, but he will shortly remove to another house, and then your time will have come. Chapter 22. The Conspiracy. The next day Wallenstein again entered Malcolm's workroom and said abruptly to him, "What deeds of bravery have you performed?" Malcolm looked astonished. "In an idle moment, having an interest in nativities and seeing that you were born between 2 years, I asked my astrologer to work out the calculations. He tells me it was fated that you should perform deeds of notable bravery while still young. It seemed the horoscope of a soldier rather than of a craftsman. And so I told the sage, but he will have it that he has made no mistake." Malcolm hesitated for a moment. The blind faith which the otherwise intelligent and capable general placed in the science of astrology was well known to the world. Should he deny that he had accomplished any feats, the Duke, believing implicitly the statement which his astrologer had made him, would suspect that he was not what he seemed. He therefore replied modestly, "I have done no deeds worthy relating to your excellency, but I once swam across a swollen river to direct some travelers who would otherwise have perished, and my neighbors were good enough to say that None in those parts save myself would have attempted such a feat." "Ah," the Duke exclaimed in a tone of satisfaction. "As usual, the stars have spoken correctly. Doubtless as great courage is required to swim a river in flood as to charge into the ranks of the enemy." So saying, Wallenstein left the room, filled with a desire to attach himself to the young man whom his adviser had assured him was, in some way, connected with his destiny. Wallenstein, a day or two later, offered Malcolm to take him into his permanent service, saying that he was frequently plagued by the stoppages of his clocks, and desired to have a craftsman capable of attending to them on his establishment. He even told the young man that he might expect promotion altogether beyond his present station. Malcolm could not refuse so flattering an offer, and was at once installed as a member of Wallenstein's household, declining, however, the use of the apartment which the steward offered him, saying that he had a sick brother lodging with him in the town. Mingling with the soldiers in the evenings, Malcolm learned that there were rumors that negotiations for peace were going on with Saxony and Sweden. This was indeed the case, but Wallenstein was negotiating on his own behalf, and not on that of the emperor. So far, but little had come of these negotiations, for Oxenstiern had the strongest doubts of Wallenstein's sincerity, and believed that he was only trying to gain time and delay operations by pretended proposals for peace. He could not believe that the great imperialist general, the right hand of the emperor, had any real intention of turning against his master. Towards the end of January, there was some excitement in Pilsen, owing to the arrival there of all the generals of the imperialist army, save only Gallus, Colloredo, and Altringer. Malcolm was sure that such a gathering could only have been summoned by Wallenstein upon some matter of the most vital importance, and he determined at all hazards to learn what was taking place in order that he might enlighten Oxenstiern as to the real sentiments of the Duke. Learning that the principal chamber in the castle had been cleared, and that a meeting of the officers would take place there in the evening, he told Thekla, when he went home to his meal at midday, that she must not be surprised if he did not return until a late hour. He continued his work until nearly 6 o'clock, the time at which the meeting was to begin, and then, extinguishing his light, made his way through the passages of the castle until he reached the council chamber. He waited in the vicinity of the chamber until he saw an opportunity for entering unobserved, then stole into the room and secreted himself behind the arras beneath a table standing against the wall, where, being in shadow, the bulge in the hanging would not attract attention. In a few minutes he heard heavy steps with a clanking of swords and jingling of spurs, and knew that the council was beginning to assemble. The hum of conversation rose louder. Then he heard the door of the apartment closed. The council was about to commence. Then a voice, that of Field Marshal Illo, one of the 3 men in Wallenstein's confidence, rose in the silence. He began by laying before the army the orders which the emperor had sent for its dispersal to various parts of the country, and by the turn he gave to these, excited the indignation of the assembly. He then expatiated with much eloquence upon the merits of the army and its generals, and upon the ingratitude with which the emperor had treated them. The court, he said, was governed by Spanish influence. The ministry were in the pay of Spain. Wallenstein alone had hitherto opposed this tyranny, and had thus drawn upon himself the deadly enmity of the Spaniards. To remove him from the command, or to make away with him entirely, had, he asserted, been long the end of their desires, and until they could succeed, they endeavored to abridge his power in the field. The supreme command was to be placed in the hands of the King of Hungary, as this prince was the passive instrument of Spain. It was only with the view of weakening the army that 6,000 troops were to be detached from it, and solely to harass it by a winter campaign that they were now called upon at this inhospitable season to undertake the recovery of Ratisbon. The ministry enriched themselves with the treasure wrung from the provinces, and squandered the money intended for the pay of the troops. The general, then, was unable to keep his engagements to the army. For all the services which for 22 years he had rendered to the House of Austria, in return for all the difficulties with which he had struggled, all the treasures of his own which he had expended in the imperial service, a second disgraceful dismissal awaited him. But he was resolved the matter should not come to this. He was determined voluntarily to resign the command before it should be wrested from his hands.
"And this,"
continued Marshal Illo,
"is what he has commissioned me to inform you."
It was now for each man present to consider who was to repay him the sums he had expended in the emperor's service, and how he could reap the rewards for his bravery and devotion when their sole advocate was removed from them. A loud cry broke from all the officers that they would not permit Wallenstein to be taken from them, and after much discussion, 4 of the officers were appointed as a deputation to the Duke to beg him not to withdraw from them. The 4 officers repaired to the private chamber of the general. They returned in a short time, saying that the Duke refused to yield. Another deputation was sent. These returned with the news that Wallenstein had reluctantly yielded to their request, but upon the condition that each of them should give a written promise to truly and firmly adhere to him, neither to separate or to allow himself to be separated from him, and to shed his last drop of blood in his defense. Whoever should break this covenant, so long as Wallenstein should employ the army in the emperor's service, was to be regarded as a perfidious traitor, and to be treated by the rest as a common enemy. As these last words appeared to indicate clearly that Wallenstein had no thought of assuming a position hostile to the emperor, or of defying his authority, save in the point of refusing to be separated from his army, all present agreed to sign the documents. Marshal Illo said,
"Then, gentlemen, I will have the document for your signatures at once drawn up. A banquet has been prepared in the next room. At its conclusion, the document shall be ready."
Malcolm, from his hiding place, heard the officers leave the apartment, and looking cautiously out, saw that the chamber was entirely empty. He determined, however, to remain and hear the conclusion of the conference. He left his hiding place and made his way to the door which separated him from the banqueting hall. Listening intently at the keyhole, he heard the clinking of glasses and the sound of voices loudly raised, and guessed that the revelry was at its height. More and more noisy did it become, for Marshal Illo was plying his guests with wine in order that they might sign without examination the document he had prepared for their signatures. Feeling confident that none would hear him, Malcolm cautiously opened the door an inch to hear and see all that passed. It was another hour before Marshal Illo produced the document and passed it round for signature. Many of those to whom it was handed signed it at once without reading the engagement, but one, more sober than the rest, insisted on reading it through, and at once rising to his feet, announced to the others that the important words, quote, "as long as Wallenstein shall employ the army for the emperor's service," end quote, which had been inserted in the first draft agreed to by Wallenstein and the deputation, had been omitted. A scene of noisy confusion ensued. Several of the officers declared that they would not sign the document as it stood. General Piccolomini, who had only attended the meeting in order that he might inform the emperor, to whom he was devoted, of what took place there, had drunk so much wine he forgot the part he was playing, and rose to his feet, and with drunken gravity proposed the health of the emperor. Louder and louder grew the din of tongues, until Count Tersky, who was in Wallenstein's confidence, arose. In a thundering voice he declared that all perjured villains who should recede from their engagement would, according to their agreement, be treated as enemies by the rest. His menaces, and the evident danger which any who might now draw back would run, overcame the scruples of the recalcitrants, and all signed the paper. This done, the meeting broke up, and Malcolm, stealing away from his post of observation, made his way back to his lodgings. He slept little that night. What he had seen convinced him that Wallenstein was really in earnest in the propositions he had made to Oxenstiern and the Elector of Saxony, and that he meditated an open rebellion against the emperor. It was of extreme importance that Oxenstiern should be made acquainted with these facts, but it would be next to impossible to escape from Pilsen and to cross the country which intervened between the two armies, which was constantly traversed by cavalry parties of both sides. He determined upon the bold course of frankly informing Wallenstein who he was and what he had heard, and to beg him to furnish him with an escort to pass through the lines
in order that he might make his way with all speed to Oxenstiern, in order to assure him of the good faith of the Duke and of the importance of his speedily accepting his proposals. It was possible, of course, that he might fall a victim to Wallenstein's anger when he found out that he had been duped, and the plot in which he was engaged discovered. But he resolved to run the risk, believing that the Duke would see the advantage to be gained by complying with his proposal. It was necessary, however, to prepare Thekla for the worst. "Thekla," he said in the morning, "an end has come to our stay here. Circumstances have occurred which will either enable us to continue our journey at once and in safety, or which may place me in a prison." Thekla gave a cry of surprise and terror. "Should I not return by nightfall, you will tell the woman of the house, who is aware that I am employed by Wallenstein, that I have been sent by him to examine and set in order the clocks in his palace in Vienna, but that as you were too unwell to travel, I bade you remain here until I return. You have an ample supply of money, even without the purse of gold which the Duke presented to me yesterday. Remain here quietly until the spring, when the tide of war is sure to roll away to some other quarter, and I trust that, long ere that, I shall be free to come to you again. But if not, dispatch this letter which I have written for you to Jans Borhoff. I have also written you a letter to the commander of any Swedish force which may enter this town, telling him who you are, and praying him to forward you under an escort to Nuremberg." "But what shall I do without you?" "I trust that you will not have to do without me, and that tomorrow we shall be upon our way to the Swedish outposts. I only give you instructions in case of the worst." Malcolm was deeply troubled at the thought that the girl might be left alone and unprotected in a strange place, and it was with a heavy heart that he took his way to the castle. But he felt that his duty was imperative, and was at heart convinced that Wallenstein would eagerly embrace his offer. It was not until midday that he was able to see the Duke. Wallenstein had been angered and alarmed at the resistance which his scheme had met with on the previous evening. He had believed that his favors and liberality had so thoroughly attached his generals to his person that they would have followed him without hesitation. The discovery that they shrank alarmed at the idea of disloyalty to the emperor showed that his position was dangerous in the extreme. He found that the signatures to the document had, for the most part, been scrawled so illegibly that the writers would be able to repudiate them, and the deceit was evidently intended. In the morning, he called together the generals, and pouring out the bitterest reproaches against the court, reminded them of their opposition to the proposition set before them on the previous evening, and declared that this circumstance had induced him to retract his own promise, and that he should at once resign his command. The generals, in confusion and dismay, offered their apologies for their conduct on the previous evening, and offered to sign anew the engagement which bound them to him. This was done. It now remained only for Wallenstein to obtain the adhesion of Gallas, Altringer, and Colloredo, which, as they held important separate commands, was necessary for the success of his plan. Messengers were accordingly sent out at once to request them to come instantly to Pilsen. After this business was dispatched, Wallenstein was informed that Malcolm desired earnestly to speak to him. Greatly surprised, he ordered that he should be shown in. "Your Excellency," Malcolm began when they were alone, "what I am about to say may anger you, but as I trust that much advantage may arise from my communication, I implore you to restrain your anger until you hear me to the end, after which it will be for you to do with me as you will." Malcolm then began, "I am, sir, no clockmaker." He then explained everything. When he reached the moment in his narration when he said, "In pursuance of my plan, I yesterday concealed myself and overheard all that passed in the council chamber with the officers and at the banquet," Wallenstein leaped to his feet with an angry exclamation. But Malcolm went on quietly, "I could have kept all this to myself and used it to the benefit or detriment of your Excellency. But it seemed to me that I should benefit at once your designs and the cause I serve by frankly acquainting you with what I have discovered. It is of all things important to you that the Swedish Chancellor should be thoroughly convinced that it is your intention to make common cause with him in forcing the Emperor to accept the conditions which you and he, united, may impose upon him. This the information I have acquired will assuredly suffice to do, and he will, without doubt, at once set his army in motion to act in concert with yours."
Wallenstein paced the room for a minute or two in silence. At length he said,
"The stars truly said you are a brave man, and that your destiny is connected with mine. Assuredly, none but a brave man would tell me he had spied in my counsels. The news may well induce Oxenstiern at once to embrace my offer. What then do you propose?"
"I would ask, sir, that you would order a squadron of horse to escort me and my companion through the debatable land between your army and that of the Swedes, with orders for us to pass freely on as soon as we are beyond your outposts and in the neighborhood of those of the Swedes."
"It shall be done," Wallenstein said. "In half an hour, a squadron of horse shall be drawn up in the courtyard, and the horse and pillion in readiness for yourself and the maiden. In the meantime, I will prepare a letter for the Swedish Chancellor."
Chapter 23. The Murder of Wallenstein. Malcolm hurried back to his lodging, where he was received with a cry of delight from Thekla, who had passed the time since he had left her, praying for his safety. He told her that she was about to be restored to safety among friends, and that she was again to resume her proper garments, which she had brought with her in the basket containing his tools at the time of her flight. A few minutes sufficed to make the change, and then she accompanied Malcolm to the castle. A squadron of cavalry were formed up in the courtyard, and in front of them an attendant held a horse with a pillion behind the saddle. Malcolm lifted Thekla onto the pillion and sprang into the saddle in front of her. One of Wallenstein's household handed a letter to him, then gave him into the charge of the officer commanding the squadron, who had already received his orders. The officer at once gave the word and rode from the castle, followed by the cavalry. As soon as they were out of the town, the pace was quickened. Until 20 miles had been covered, they halted for the night in a small town where the soldiers were billeted on the inhabitants, comfortable apartments being assigned to Malcolm and his charge. Soon after daybreak, the journey continued. Late in the afternoon, the troop halted on the crest of a low hill.
"Here we part," the officer said. "That town across the river is held by the Swedes, and you will certainly meet with no molestation from any of our side as you ride down to it."
Malcolm thanked the officer and then rode forward towards the town. As he neared the bridge, Malcolm's heart gave a bound as he recognized the green scarves and plumes worn by the sentries at the bridge. These, seeing only a single horseman with a female behind him, did not attempt to question him as he passed, but he reined in his horse. "Whose regiment do you belong to?" he asked. The men looked up in surprise at being addressed in their own language by one whose attire was that of a simple craftsman, but whom they now saw rode a horse of great strength and beauty.
"We belong to Hamilton's regiment," they replied.
"And where shall I find that of Monroe?"
"In quarters 15 miles away."
"Then we cannot get on there tonight. Where are your officers quartered?" A soldier standing near at once volunteered to act as guide, and in a few minutes Malcolm arrived at the house occupied by them. He was, of course, personally known to all the officers, and as soon as their surprise at his disguise, and at seeing him accompanied by a young lady, had subsided, they received him heartily. Thekla was at once taken to the house of the burgomaster and handed over to the wife of that functionary for the night, and Malcolm spent a merry evening with the Scottish officers, to whom he related his adventures, making, however, no allusion to the political secrets which he had discovered. He was furnished from the wardrobes of the officers with a suit of clothes, and he was glad to don again the uniform of the Scottish Brigade. Soon after daylight, Malcolm was again in the saddle, and with Thekla, as before, on the pillion, he continued his journey, and in 3 hours reached the town where his regiment was quartered. Alighting at the door of the colonel's quarters, he led Thekla to his apartments. The colonel received him with the greatest cordiality, and welcomed Thekla with a kindness which soon put her at her ease, for now that the danger was past, she was beginning to feel keenly the strangeness of her position. Colonel Monroe placed her in charge of the wife of one of the principal citizens, who, upon hearing that she was the daughter of the Count of Mansfeld, willingly received her and offered to retain her as her guest. Colonel Monroe said, as soon as Malcolm informed him of the important information he had gained,
"Your news alters the whole course of events and offers hopes of an early termination of the struggle. You must ride with all haste to Oxenstiern with your tidings. Not a moment must be lost.
It'll take you 4 days of hard riding at the least to reach him. In the meantime, I will see that the young lady is comfortable and well cared for. In case of anything extraordinary occurring which might render this town unsafe, I will forward her in safety to Nuremberg, even if I have to detach a score of my men as her escort." Before mounting again, Malcolm paid a hurried visit to Thekla, who expressed her contentment with her new abode, and her readiness to stay there until he should return to take her to Nuremberg. "Colonel Monroe and your Scotch officers will, I am sure, take good care of me till you return," she said. Malcolm mounted his horse with a light heart and galloped away. 4 days later, he was closeted with the Swedish chancellor, relating to him the scene in the castle at Pilsen. When he had finished, Oxenstiern, who had, before Malcolm began, read the letter from Wallenstein, said, "There can be no longer the slightest doubts of Wallenstein's intention. Ever since the death of King Gustavus, Wallenstein has been negotiating privately with me, but I could not believe that he was in earnest, or that such monstrous treachery was possible. But his ambition is even greater than his military talent, and it is clear that he aims to dethrone the emperor and set himself up in his place. But though he has the will to join us, has he the power? Wallenstein, with his generals and his army fighting for the emperor, is a mighty personage, but Wallenstein, a rebel, is another altogether. By what you tell me, it seems doubtful whether his officers will follow him, and although his army is attached to him, each section will obey the orders which the general in its command may give. Probably some of those who signed the documents of fidelity to Wallenstein have already sent news to the emperor. However, one thing is certain. He and as much of his army as he can hold are now our allies, and I must lose no time in moving such troops as are most easily disposable to his assistance. I will pen a dispatch accepting his alliance and promising him active aid as soon as possible. What say you, young sir? Will you undertake to carry my dispatch? You must not travel as a Scottish officer, for if there are any traitors among the officers of Wallenstein, they will assuredly endeavor to intercept any dispatches between us as proofs of the Duke's guilt." "I will undertake the task willingly, sir," Malcolm replied. "When I reach him, is it your wish that I should remain near him, or that I should at once return?" "It were best you should remain for a time. You may be able to send me news. You should be supplied with an ample amount of money to pay messengers to bring your reports to me." Malcolm obtained a fresh horse and again set out. He made the journey at the same speed at which he had before passed over the ground, and paused for a few hours only at Amberg, where he found Thekla quite recovered from the effects of her journeys and anxiety. She received him with delight, but her joy was dashed when she found that, instead of returning to remain with his regiment, he was only passing through on another mission. At Amberg he again donned his costume as a craftsman. Colonel Monroe gave him an escort of 20 troopers. With these he crossed the river at nightfall. He then handed over his horse to his escort, who started on their way back to Amberg, while he pursued his journey on foot towards Pilsen. Late the next evening he reached the town. Wallenstein was still there. The imperialist general, upon obtaining the signature of his officers, had sent to urge Altringer and Gallas, who had been absent from the meeting, to come to him with all speed. Altringer, on pretense of sickness, did not comply. Gallas made his appearance with the intention of finding out Wallenstein's plans and keeping the emperor informed of them. Piccolomini had, immediately after the meeting broke up, sent full details of its proceedings to the court, and Gallas was furnished with a secret commission containing the emperor's orders to the colonels and officers, granting an amnesty for their adhesion to Wallenstein at Pilsen, and ordering them to make known to the army that it was now placed under the command of Gallas himself, who received orders, if possible, to arrest Wallenstein. Gallas perceived the impossibility of executing his commission, for Wallenstein's troops and officers were devoted to him, and not even the crime of high treason could overcome their veneration for him. Fearful that Wallenstein should discover the commission with which he was charged, Gallas sought to escape from Pilsen, and offered to go to Altringer and persuade him to return with him. Wallenstein had no doubts of the fidelity of the general, and allowed him to depart. As he did not return at once, Piccolomini, also most anxious to get out of the grasp of Wallenstein, offered to go fetch both Gallas and Altringer. Wallenstein consented, And no sooner had Piccolomini left him than he hurried to his own command, denounced Wallenstein as a traitor, and prepared to surprise the Duke in Pilsen. Gallas, at the same time, sent round copies of his commission to all the imperial camps. Malcolm, upon his arrival, proceeded to the castle. In a few minutes he was ushered into Wallenstein's presence, and he handed him the letter from Oxenstiern. Wallenstein tore it open without a word, and gave an exclamation of satisfaction as he glanced it through. "This is opportune, indeed," he said, "and I thank you for bringing me the news so rapidly. Well did the astrologer say that my destiny to some extent depended on you. The Chancellor tells me that the Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg will march instantly with 4,000 men to join me, and Duke Bernhard will move at once with 6,000 of the best Swedish troops. I may yet be even with the traitors." Although the defection of Gallas and Piccolomini and the news of the issue of the imperial proclamation had fallen with stunning force upon Wallenstein, he had still faith in the fidelity of the army at large, and he had already dispatched Marshal Tersky to Prague, where all the troops faithful to him were to assemble, intending to follow himself with the regiments at Pilsen. His astrologer still assured him that the stars were favorable, and Wallenstein's faith in his own destiny was unshaken. Upon finding that Malcolm had orders to remain with him, he ordered handsome apartments to be prepared for him, and as there was no longer any reason why the fact that a Swedish officer was in the castle should be concealed, he commanded that Malcolm should be furnished with handsome raiment of all sorts and a suit of superb armor. The following morning, Wallenstein sent for him. "I have bad news," he said. "I fear that the influence of Piccolomini, Gallas, and Aldringer have withdrawn from me the corps which they command. Tersky will return tomorrow morning, and I shall then march with him and the troops here to Egra to effect a junction with Duke Bernhard." Wallenstein still appeared confident, but the outlook seemed to Malcolm extremely gloomy. The whole army, save the regiments around Pilsen, had fallen away from Wallenstein. His princely generosity to the generals and officers, and his popularity among the troops, had failed to attach them to him now that he had declared against the emperor, and it appeared to Malcolm that he would be able to bring over to the Swedish cause only the corps which he immediately commanded. Still, his defection would cause a vast gap in the imperial defenses, and the loss of the services of the greatest of their leaders would be a heavy blow to the imperialist cause, which had been almost solely supported by his commanding talents and his vast private income. Tersky arrived the following morning, and the same afternoon, Wallenstein, with the whole of the troops at Pilsen, marched towards Egra. Among the officers attached to Wallenstein's person was a Scotchman named Leslie, to whom, and a few other confidants, Wallenstein had confided his designs. Wallenstein had at once introduced Malcolm to him, and the two rode in company during the march to Egra. Malcolm did not find him a cheerful companion. They chatted at times of the engagements in which both had taken part on opposite sides, but Malcolm saw that his companion was preoccupied, and avoided any conversation as to the turn which events had taken. At the end of the first day's ride, Malcolm came to the conclusion that his companion's heart was far from being in the enterprise on which they were engaged. The following day he avoided joining him, and rode with some of the other officers. Upon their arrival at Egra, the gates were opened at their approach, and Colonel Butler, an Irishman who commanded the garrison, met Wallenstein as he entered, and saluted him with all honor. A few hours later, Wallenstein received news that an imperial edict had been issued proclaiming him a traitor and an outlaw. He also learned that the corps under the Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg was within a day's march of Egra. As soon as the Duke retired to his apartments, Leslie sought out Colonel Butler and revealed to him the purposes of Wallenstein, and informed him of the imperial order absolving the army from their allegiance to him. The two men, with Lieutenant Colonel Gordon, another imperialist officer, at first determined to capture Wallenstein and hand him over to the emperor. But finally they agreed that more urgent steps must be taken. That evening a banquet was given by Butler to Wallenstein and his officers. Malcolm was also present. The Duke, however, was too anxious to appear at it, and remained in his own apartment. Wallenstein's health was drunk in full bumpers, and his friends boasted that in a few days he would find himself at the head of as powerful an army as he had ever before commanded. But it seemed to Malcolm that their gaiety was forced and unnatural, and a sense of danger came over him. The danger, indeed, was great. The drawbridge of the castle had been drawn up, the avenues leading to it guarded, and 20 infantry soldiers and 6 of Butler's dragoons were in hiding in the apartment next to the banqueting hall. Dessert was placed on the table. Leslie gave a signal, and in an instant armed men placed themselves behind the chairs of Wallenstein's trusted officers with shouts of, "Long live Ferdinand!" The 3 officers instantly sprang to their feet, but were slain before they had time to draw their swords. Malcolm had sprung to his feet at the commencement of the tumult, but was pressed down again into his chair by 2 soldiers, while Leslie exclaimed, "Keep yourself quiet, sir. I would save you as a fellow countryman, but if you draw a sword to defend these traitors, you must share their fate." No sooner had the murder of the officers been accomplished than Leslie, Butler, and Gordon issued into the town. Butler's cavalry paraded the streets, and that officer quieted the garrison by telling them that Wallenstein had been proclaimed a traitor and an outlaw, and that all who were faithful to the emperor must obey their orders. The regiments most attached to Wallenstein had not entered the city, and the garrison listened to the voice of their commander. Wallenstein knew nothing of what had taken place in the castle, and had just retired to bed when a band of Butler's soldiers burst into his apartment. The Duke leaped from his bed, but before he could snatch up a sword, he was pierced through and through. So fell one of the greatest men of his age. Even to the present day, there are differences of opinion as to the extent of his guilt, but none as to the treachery with which he was murdered by his most trusted officers. That Wallenstein owed much gratitude to the emperor is unquestionable, but on the other hand, he had even a greater title to the gratitude of Ferdinand, whose crown and empire he had repeatedly saved. Wallenstein was no bigot. His views were broad and enlightened, and he was therefore viewed with the greatest hostility by the violent Catholics around the king, by Maximilian of Bavaria, by the Spaniards, and by the Jesuits, who were all powerful at court. These had once before brought about his dismissal from command after he had rendered supreme services, and their intrigues against him were again at the point of success when Wallenstein determined to defy and dethrone the emperor, and it may truly be said that he was goaded into rebellion. The verdict of posterity has certainly been favorable to him, and the dastardly murder, which requited a lifetime of brilliant services, has been held to more than counterbalance the faults he committed. Chapter 24. Malcolm's Escape. After the fall of Wallenstein's colonels, Malcolm was led away to a dungeon in the castle. It was not until the door closed behind him that he could fairly realize what had taken place. So sudden and unexpected had been the scene in the banqueting hall. 5 minutes before, he had been feasting and drinking the health of Wallenstein. Now, he was a prisoner of the Imperialists. Wallenstein's adherents had been murdered, and it was probable that a like fate would befall the general himself. The alliance which had seemed to offer a termination of the long, bloody struggle was cut short at a blow. His own fate seemed dark enough. There was an almost personal hatred between the combatants, and on each side, many who had fallen into the hands of their foes had been treated with such harshness that they had died. However, Malcolm had gone through so many adventures that even the scene which he had witnessed and his own uncertain fate were insufficient to banish sleep from his eyes. The sun was shining through the loophole of his dungeon when he awoke. For an hour he occupied himself in polishing carefully the magnificently inlaid armor which Wallenstein had presented him, and which, with the exception of his helmet, he had not laid aside when he sat down to the banquet. For except when quartered in towns far removed from an enemy, officers seldom laid aside their arms. He still retained his sword and dagger, for his captors, in their haste, had omitted to take them from him when they hurried him away. With his dagger, he could shove back the lock of the door, but this was firmly held by bolts without. Thinking that on some future occasion the blade might be useful to him, he pushed the dagger well into the lock, and with a sharp jerk snapped it off at the hilt. Then he concealed the steel within his long boot and cast the hilt through the loophole. Presently a soldier brought him breakfast, consisting of bread and wine. He was visited again at dinner and supper. Before the soldier came in the first time, Malcolm concealed his sword in the straw, thinking that the soldier would be sure to remove it if he noticed it. The man who brought his breakfast and dinner made no reply to his questions. But another man brought his supper, and he turned out of a more communicative disposition.
I don't know much about it, but I know that Wallenstein is dead. Everyone is content that the traitor has been punished, and as the troops have all pronounced for the Emperor, everything is quiet. We had a good laugh this afternoon. The colonel sent out one of our men dressed up in Wallenstein's livery to meet the Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg and invite him to join him here. The Duke suspected no danger, and you should have seen his face when, after passing through the gates, he suddenly found himself surrounded by our men and a prisoner. Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar will be here tomorrow, they say, and we shall catch him in the same way.
This news heightened Malcolm's uneasiness. The capture of Duke Bernhard, the most brilliant of the German generals on the Protestant side, would be a heavy blow to the cause, and Malcolm walked up and down in his cell in a fever of rage at his impotence to prevent so serious a disaster. At last he threw himself down upon the straw, but was unable to sleep. The death of Wallenstein had made a deep impression upon him. Not only was he admired for his immense military talents, but he carried on the war with a chivalry and humanity which contrasted strongly with the ferocity of Tilly, Pappenheim, and Piccolomini. Prisoners who fell into his hands were treated with courtesy, and no massacres, such as those which had caused the names of Tilly and Pappenheim to be held in abhorrence by the Protestants of Germany, were associated with that of Wallenstein. Then, too, the dignity and noble presence of the Duke had greatly impressed the young soldier, and the courtesy with which he had treated him personally had attracted his liking as well as respect. To think that this great general, this princely noble, who alone had baffled the Lion of the North, had been foully murdered by those he had trusted and favored, filled him with grief and indignation. The thought that on the morrow Duke Bernhard, a leader in importance second only to the Chancellor of Sweden, would fall unsuspiciously into the trap set for him, goaded him almost to madness, and he tossed restlessly on the straw through the long hours of the night. Towards morning, he heard a faint creaking of bolts. Then there was a sound of the locks of the door being turned. He grasped his sword and sprang to his feet. He heard the door close again, and then a man produced a lantern from beneath a long cloak, and he saw Wallenstein's steward before him. The old man's eyes were bloodshot with weeping, and his face betokened the anguish which the death of his master had caused him. "You have heard the news?" he asked. "Alas," Malcolm replied, "I have heard it indeed." "I am determined," the old man said, "to thwart the projects of these murderers and to have vengeance upon them. None thought of me, an old man, too insignificant for notice, and I have passed the day in my chamber, lamenting the kindest of masters. The soldiers have been feasting and drinking all night, and have fallen into a drunken slumber, and I was able to possess myself of the key of your dungeon. Here is your helmet. I will lead you to the stable, where I have saddled the fastest of my master's horses. Remain there quietly until you deem that the gates are open. Then ride for your life. Few will know you, and you will probably pass out of the gate unquestioned. If not, you have your sword. You will run no risk, I hope, for your share in this adventure. They will not suspect me. I shall lock the door behind us and place the key again in the girdle of the drunken guard, and then return to my own chamber." Quietly they made their way through the castle and out into the courtyard. Then they entered the stables. "This horse was my master's favorite," the steward said, again uncovering his lantern. "And now, farewell. May heaven give you good fortune." So saying, he set down his lantern and left Malcolm alone. The latter, after examining the saddle and bridle, extinguished the light. In 2 hours a faint light began to show itself. Presently, the noise of footsteps and voices was heard in the courtyard. Malcolm still delayed his start, as it would be fatal were he to set out before the opening of the gates. At last he felt sure that they must be opened to admit the country people coming in with supplies for the market. He donned his helmet, quietly opened the stable door, sprang into the saddle, and rode boldly out. Several soldiers were loitering about the courtyard. The sudden appearance of a mounted officer, armed from head to foot, caused a general pause in their occupation, but they paid no further heed to him, as quietly and without any sign of haste, he rode through the gateway of the castle into the town. Malcolm rode on at a foot pace until he was within sight of the open gate of the town. When within 50 yards of the gate, he suddenly came upon Colonel Leslie, who had been making a tour of the walls to see that the sentries were upon the alert. Leslie instantly recognized Malcolm. "Captain Graham!" he exclaimed. "Treachery! Shut the gate!" And drawing his sword, he threw himself in Malcolm's way. Malcolm touched the horse with his spur, and it bounded forward. He parried the blow which Leslie struck at him, and with a sweeping cut, struck him to the ground, and dashed onward. A sentry was beginning to shut the gate, and his comrades were running out from the guardhouse as Malcolm galloped up. The steward had fastened the holsters onto the saddle, and Malcolm, before starting, had seen to the priming of the pistols in them. Drawing one, he shot the man who was closing the gate, and before his comrades could run up, dashed through it and over the drawbridge. Several bullets whizzed around him, but he was soon out of range, and galloping at full speed in the direction in which the steward had told him that Duke Bernhard was encamped. In half an hour, Malcolm reached the Swedish lines. He rode at once to the tent of the Duke, who was upon the point of mounting. Beside him stood a man in the livery of Wallenstein. Malcolm drew his pistol and said to the man, "If you move a foot, I will send a bullet through your head." "What is this?" exclaimed the Duke in astonishment. "Who are you, sir?" "I am Captain Graham of Monroe's regiment, and I have ridden here to warn your Excellency of treachery. Wallenstein has been foully murdered. Egra is in the hands of the Imperialists. The Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg has been beguiled into a trap and taken prisoner, and this fellow, who is one of Butler's troopers, has been sent here to lead you into a like snare." "Wallenstein murdered? Impossible!" "I myself saw his friends Illo, Tersky, and Kinsky assassinated at a banquet. Wallenstein was murdered by his favorites, Leslie and Gordon, and the Irishman, Butler. I was seized and thrown into a dungeon, but have escaped by a miracle to warn you of your danger." "This is a blow indeed," the Duke said mournfully. Turning to his attendants, he ordered them to hang the false messenger to the nearest tree, then begged Malcolm to follow him into his tent and give him full details. "This upsets all our schemes," the Duke said when he had concluded. "What is the strength of the garrison at Egra?" There were Butler's dragoons and an infantry regiment in garrison when we arrived. 6 regiments accompanied us on the march, and I fear that all these must now be considered as having gone over to the Imperialists. "Then their force is superior to my own, for I have but 6,000 men with me, and have no artillery heavy enough to make any impression upon the walls of the town. Much as I should like to meet these traitors and deal out to them the punishment they deserve, I cannot until I have communicated this terrible news to the Swedish Chancellor. Egra was all important, as affording us an entrance into Bohemia, so long as Wallenstein was with us. But now that he has been murdered, I cannot risk the destruction of my force by an assault upon the city, which is no longer of use to us." Malcolm could not but feel that the Duke's view was, under the circumstances, the correct one. The tents were speedily struck, and the force fell back with all speed towards Bavaria, and after accompanying them for a march or two, Malcolm left them and rode to join his regiment. After staying a day or two, Malcolm obtained leave from his colonel to escort Thekla to Nuremberg. Monroe gave him an escort of 12 troopers, and with these he journeyed to Nuremberg, where the worthy syndic of the clockmakers and his wife gladly received Thekla. Here Malcolm took possession of his arms and valises, which he had sent, upon starting for Prague, to the care of Jans Boerhaave. Not that he needed the armor, for the suit which Wallenstein had given him was the admiration and envy of his comrades. There were tears on Thekla's part as her young protector bade her adieu, for there was no saying how long a time might elapse before she might again see him. Shortly after rejoining his regiment, Malcolm received a communication from the Swedish Chancellor expressing his approbation for the great service he had rendered by warning the Duke of Saxe-Weimar of the trap which the Imperialists had set for him. The death of Wallenstein was followed by a short pause in the war. The Emperor heaped favors and honors upon the three men who had plotted and carried out Wallenstein's murder. Then he appointed his son Ferdinand, King of Hungary, to the chief command of the army, with General Gallas as his principal adviser. Early in May, the new imperial general marched to lay siege to Ratisbon. The imperial army now numbered 35,000 men. Duke Bernhard could only put 15,000 in the field. With so great a disparity of force, he could not offer battle. But in every way, he harassed and interrupted the advance of the Imperialists, while he sent pressing messages to Oxenstiern for men and money, and to Marshal Horn, who commanded in Alsace, to beg him march with all haste to his assistance. Unfortunately, Marshal Horn, although a good general, was slow and overcautious. Besides, Horn was a little jealous that Duke Bernhard should be placed in the position of general-in-chief, and this feeling no doubt tended to increase his caution and delay his action. Consequently, Ratisbon, after a valiant defense, surrendered before Horn had effected a junction with Duke Bernhard's army. The Imperialists then marched upon Donauwörth, and this place, after a feeble defense, also capitulated. The Duke, heartbroken at seeing the conquest, which had been effected at so great a loss of life and treasure, wrested from his hands while he was unable to strike a blow to save them, marched away to Swabia to meet the slowly advancing army of Marshal Horn. No sooner was the junction effected than he turned quickly back, and he reached the vicinity of Nordlingen only to find the enemy already posted on the more advanced of the two heights which dominate the plain. By a skillful maneuver, however, he was enabled to throw within its walls a reinforcement to the garrison of 800 men. Nordlingen was surrounded by a wall, interspersed with numerous towers, sufficiently strong to guard it against any surprise, but not to defend it against siege by a numerous army. The vast plain on which the town stands is broken near its center by two heights rising at a distance of 3,000 yards from each other. The height nearest to the town, steep and craggy, is known as the Weinberg. The other is called Allersheim. A village stands some 300 yards in advance of the valley between these heights. The Scotch Brigade formed part of Duke Bernhard's command. It was now nearly 2 years since a pitched battle had been fought, for no great encounter had taken place between the armies since Gustavus fell at Lutzen. In the time which had elapsed, many recruits had arrived from Scotland, and Monroe's regiment had again risen to the strength at which it had landed at Rügen 4 years before. Not half a dozen of the officers who had then marched in its ranks were now present. Death had been busy among them. On the evening of their arrival in sight of the Imperialist army, the two Grahams supped with Colonel Monroe, who told them, "The Duke and Horn are not of one mind. The Duke wants to fight. He urges that were we to allow Nordlingen to fall, without striking a blow to save it, it would have the worst possible effect throughout Germany. But Horn reasons that the enemy is superior to us by at least a third, and to save the town, we must attack them in an immensely strong position. The Rhinegrave, Otto Ludwig, with 7,000 men, is within a few marches of us. In a short time, therefore, will actually outnumber the enemy, and I have no doubt we shall fight a great battle to save Nordlingen." Chapter 25. Nordlingen. While Colonel Monroe and his companions were discussing the matter, a council of war was being held, and Duke Bernhard's view was adopted by all his generals. Horn, therefore, was forced to give way. Up to nightfall, the Imperialists had shown no signs of an intention to occupy the Weinberg, their forces being massed on and around the Allersheim hill. It was determined, therefore, to seize the Weinberg at once, and the execution of this step was committed to Horn. The choice was unfortunate. Victory depended upon the prompt carrying out of the service, and Horn, though brave and capable, was slow and cautious, and it was not until midnight that he reached the foot of the hill. Here he came to the conclusion that he should meet with great obstacles in ascending the hill in the dark. He therefore took the fatal resolution of remaining where he was until daylight. Had he continued his march, he would have reached the summit of the Weinberg unopposed, and the fate of the battle on the following day would have been changed. But the imperialist leaders, mindful of the commanding position of the hill upon which Horn was marching, had given orders that it should be occupied before daylight by 400 Spaniards. The commander of this force was as overprompt in the execution of his orders as Horn was overcautious. He reached the top of the Weinberg before midnight, and at once set his men to work to entrench themselves strongly. As soon as daybreak enabled Horn to see the fatal consequences which had arisen from his delay, he ordered his men to advance. With their usual gallantry, the Swedes mounted the hill and rushed at the entrenchment. It was defended with the greatest obstinacy and courage by the Spaniards, but after desperate fighting, the Swedes forced their way into the work at 2 points, and were upon the point of capturing the position when an ammunition wagon accidentally exploded in their midst, killing great numbers and throwing the rest into temporary disorder, which enabled the Spaniards to drive them out and again occupy the entrenchments. Before the Swedes had fully recovered themselves, Spanish cavalry, which at the first sound of the conflict had been ordered to the spot, charged them in flank and forced them to retreat down the hillside. Bitterly regretting his delay at midnight, Horn brought up fresh troops and led the united body to the assault. But the Weinberg, which had been occupied in the early morning by only 400 men, was now defended by the whole of the Spanish infantry. Vain now was the energy of Horn, and ineffectual the valor of his troops. Each assault was repulsed with prodigious slaughter. Duke Bernhard was now fully engaged with the Imperialists on the Allersheim, and gradually gaining ground. Seeing, however, how fruitless were the efforts of Horn to capture the Weinberg, he dispatched as many of his infantry as he could to reinforce the marshal. Among these was Monro's regiment. "Now, lads," Colonel Monro shouted as he led his regiment against the hill, "show him what Scottish hearts can do." With a cheer, the regiment advanced. Pressing forward unflinchingly under a hail of bullets, they won their way up the hill, then hurled themselves with a shout upon the heavy masses of Spanish veterans. For a moment, the latter recoiled. Then they closed in around the Scots, who had already lost a third of their number ascending the hill. Never did the famous regiment fight with greater courage and fury. But they were outnumbered 10-1, and their opponents were soldiers of European reputation. In vain the Scotchmen strove to break through the line of pikes which surrounded them. Fighting desperately in the front rank, Monro at last shouted to the remains of his followers to form in a solid body and cut their way through the enemy who surrounded them. The Scottish spearmen obeyed, and, headed by their colonel, flung themselves with a sudden rush upon the enemy. Before the weight and fury of this charge, the veterans of Spain gave way, and the Scots found themselves on the crest of the hill. No sooner were they free from the Spanish ranks than the musketeers of Spain opened fire upon them, and numbers fell in the retreat down the hill. Bleeding, breathless, the survivors gathered round their commander, and Monro burst into tears on finding that, of the noble regiment he had led up the hill, scarce enough remained to form a single company. 7 times now had Horn striven to carry the hill. 7 times had he been repulsed with terrible slaughter. Now he began to fall back to join the force of Duke Bernhard. The latter recognized that Horn, if not speedily succored, was doomed, for the Imperialists were striving to cut him off, and he made a desperate attack upon the enemy, hoping to draw their whole force upon himself and enable Horn to retire. But he was too weak in numbers to bear the assault he had thus provoked. The Imperial cavalry charged down upon the Swedish horsemen and overthrew them so completely that these, forced back upon their infantry, threw them also into complete disorder. The instant Horn had given the orders to retreat, Colonel Monro, seeing the danger of the force being surrounded, formed up the little remnant of his regiment and set off at the double to rejoin the Duke. It was well that he did so, for just when he had passed over the intervening ground, the Imperialist cavalry, fresh from the defeat of the Swedes, swept across the ground, completely cutting off Horn's division from that of the Duke. A few minutes later, Marshal Horn, surrounded on all sides, was forced to surrender with all his command. Duke Bernhard narrowly escaped the same fate, but in the end he managed to rally some 9,000 men and retreated towards the Main. The defeat was a terrible one. 10,000 men were killed and wounded, 4,000 under Horn taken prisoners. All the guns, equipage, and baggage fell into the hands of the enemy. Nordlingen was the most decisive battle of the war. Its effect was to change a war which had been really only a civil war, fought over religion, into one with a foreign enemy. Hitherto, France had contented herself with subsidizing Sweden, who had played the principal part. Henceforward, Sweden was to occupy but a secondary position. Cardinal Richelieu of France saw the danger of allowing Austria to aggrandize itself at the expense of all Germany, and now France took the field in earnest. On the other hand, Nordlingen dissolved the confederacy of the Protestant German princes against Ferdinand II. The Elector of Saxony, ever vacillating and irresolute in his policy, set the example by making peace with the emperor, and all the leading members of the Protestant Union hastened to follow. Dukes Bernhard of Weimar and William of Cassel were almost alone in supporting the cause to maintain which Gustavus Adolphus had invaded Germany. The Swedish army, whose exploits had made the court of Vienna tremble, seemed annihilated, and well might the emperor deem that his final triumph over Protestantism was complete when he heard of the Battle of Nordlingen, for as yet he dreamed not that its result would bring France into the field against him. Malcolm Graham was one of the few officers of Monroe's regiment who burst his way through the Spanish lines on the top of the Weinberg. He was bleeding from several wounds, though none of them was serious. Nigel was beside him as they began to descend the hill, but scarcely had he gone a step when he fell headlong, struck by a bullet. Malcolm and one of the sergeants carried him to the foot of the hill. Then, when the remains of the regiments started to rejoin Duke Bernhard, they were forced to leave him. Although Malcolm kept up with his regiment in the retreat, he was so exhausted by loss of blood that he could no longer accompany them. By the death of so many of his seniors, he was now one of the majors of the regiment, if that could be called a regiment, which was scarce a company in strength. A few days after the battle, Colonel Monroe received orders to march with his shattered remnant to North Germany to await reinforcements from Scotland. Malcolm remained behind until his strength slowly returned. The colonel, before leaving, had bade him take his time, as months would probably elapse before the regiment would again be fit for service. As soon as Malcolm was able to travel, he journeyed to Nuremberg. On arriving at the abode of Jans Boerhaave, he learned that Thekla was no longer an inmate of the family. The Count of Mansfeld had died in prison, and the Countess had arrived at Nuremberg. Malcolm made his way to the house she occupied. The meeting was an affecting one. Malcolm was greatly grieved over the death of his staunch friend, and joined in the sorrow of the Countess and her daughter. A few days after his arrival, the Countess said to him, "I am of course aware, Malcolm, of the conversation which the Count had with you concerning Thekla, and my wishes fully agreed with his on the subject. In other times, one would not speak of marriage when Thekla's father had been but 2 months dead. But it is no time for conventionalities now. All southern Germany is falling away from the Protestant cause. Ere long, we may see the Imperialists at the gate of Nuremberg, and it may be that, in a few months, the whole of Germany will be in their power. Therefore, there should be no delay. Thekla is nearly 17, and you 21, young to enter upon the path of matrimony. But the events of the last few months have made a woman of her, while you have long since proved yourself a man, both in thoughtfulness and in valor. Thekla is no longer a great heiress. Since Nordlingen, we may consider that her father's estates have gone forever, and mine may follow in a few months." Malcolm said earnestly, "It matters not, for I love her with all my heart. And it needs no questioning on my part to know that she loves you. However, Malcolm, she will not come to you penniless,
foreseeing that it was possible that the war would terminate adversely, and determined to quit the country should he be forbidden to worship according to his own religion here. The Count dispatched to the care of a banker at Hamburg 10,000 gold crowns. Moreover, before the Count's death, I had an interview with my nearest kinsman, who has taken sides with the Imperialists. I offered to resign Thekla's rights as heiress to the estate for the sum of 10,000 crowns. As this was but 3 years' revenue of the estates, he consented, after having obtained the Emperor's consent, and the money has been lodged in the hands of the banker at Hamburg. Thus, Thekla has a dowry of 20,000 gold crowns, but with it you must take me also, for I would fain leave the country and end my days with her.
Malcolm said, "You keep the dowry so long as you live, Countess. It is more than the richest noble in Scotland could give with his daughter. My own estate, though small, is sufficient to keep Thekla and myself in ease, and my pleasure in having you with us will be equal to hers. You would wish, of course, that I should quit the army and return home, and I am ready to do so, for I've had more than enough of wars and fighting. I have been preserved by a miracle, and I cannot hope that such fortune would always attend me. The cause for which I have fought seems lost, and since the Protestant princes of Germany are hastening to desert it, neither honor nor common sense demand that I, a soldier of fortune and a foreigner, should struggle any longer for it. I am ready to resign my commission and return to Scotland."
"So be it," the Countess said. "But regarding Thekla's dowry, I shall insist on having my way. With this sum you can largely increase your estates and take rank among the nobles of your country."
The Countess then summoned Thekla and told her,
"Malcolm Graham has asked your hand of me. He tells me that he loves you truly. What say you, my love?"
Thekla affected neither shyness nor confusion. She advanced to Malcolm, and laying her hand in his, said,
"He cannot doubt my answer, mother. I love him with my whole heart."
A few days later, Malcolm led Thekla to the altar. The marriage was a quiet one, seeing that the bride had been so lately orphaned. Only Jans Boerhoff and his family, and 2 or 3 Scottish comrades of Malcolm's who were recovering from their wounds at Nuremberg, were present. The following day, the little party started for the north. Malcolm had received a letter from Oxenstiern accepting his resignation, thanking him heartily for the services he had rendered, and congratulating him on his wedding. Without adventure, they reached Hamburg, and there, arranging with the banker for the transmission of the sum in his hands to Edinburgh, they took ship for Scotland. 3 months later, Malcolm was delighted by the unexpected appearance of his uncle Nigel. The Imperialists had freed him in exchange for an imperial officer who had been captured by the Swedes. Thekla's dowry enabled her husband largely to increase his estates. A new and handsome mansion was erected at a short distance from the old castle, and here Malcolm lived quietly for very many years with his beautiful wife, and saw numerous progeny rise around them. To the gratification of both, 5 years after her coming to Scotland, the Countess of Mansfeld married Nigel Graham, and the pair took up their abode in the old castle, which was thoroughly repaired and set in order by Malcolm for their use. Then he and Thekla insisted that the fortune he had received as a dowry with his wife should be shared by the Countess and Nigel. The end. We hope you've enjoyed this Great Hall Productions recording of The Lion of the North by G. A. Henty. For information about more Great Hall recordings, please go to our website, www.greathall.com.